Okay, hello. So this week should take us to the end of Grapes of Wrath. Then I will just keep sending you various bits and pieces to do with kind of secondary criticism and around kind of exam prep, just to keep you on your toes, just in case you think you might end up wanting to sit the kind of the exam thing. So in terms of looking at this. We want to discuss there's a kind of circular nature to the narrative in a couple of ways as we come towards the end of this. And one of those ways in relation to kind of the return to cotton picking, essentially. Their farm has been producing cotton. They travel all the way out to California and they end up picking cotton again. So there is a sense of them kind of both making a journey but also returning to the place in which they started. We then want to think about that kind of continuation of what we said last week in terms of Tom kind of becoming this disciple for Casey, taking on this role of Casey's Peter, essentially. He becomes the kind of the disciple Peter. And we want to kind of link that into what events Steinbeck implies will happen beyond the time frame of the novel. So Steinbeck, we're right near the end. We don't have anything directly happening, but we want to be thinking about what the implication is about Tom and about Tom's future. That will be today. Tomorrow we'll look at the floods in relation to its kind of potential meanings and the future of the migrants there. And then we'll kind of consider Rose's pregnancy and the way that this is kind of changing as an image across the course of the novel, and just think kind of briefly how we can kind of link that in. Pardon me. Okay, so within chapter 27, the first thing you need to consider is how the narrative voice has changed, essentially. And the main change that we see here is that it's switched from the kind of third person perspective that we generally see throughout, and it's switched into a first person perspective. But rather than it being the kind of Steinbeck-esque voice that we've had in some of the other kind of intercalary chapters, what you've got here is the switch to the voice of the migrant worker themselves. And this contrasts with kind of earlier intercalary chapters in that it gives them a voice and it doesn't show them necessarily in a state of desperation like it's done in kind of other chapters as part of it. Now, what I'm going to need to do, you need to open up the sheet that I've given you alongside. And I've picked out various bits that kind of go with the chapter. And what you're looking to do, I've put down the kind of general kind of identify how you might discuss the following piece of evidence in relation to kind of contentment, knowledge, fulfillment, etc. You're going to work down them and you're going to link them into what I'm going to about to say in kind of a second in relation to why this chapter is important, okay? So what you're looking for here is you're looking for the way in which there is a circularity to it, and that despite them having kind of traveled all the way to California, they're doing the same as they've always done. And why this is important is because it returns them to something natural and something that gives the narrative voice a kind of sense of contentment that it doesn't necessarily have elsewhere in the novel, that there's something separate about this, there's something more fulfilled within this voice at this point. And it's the knowledge of the process. They know what they're doing, so they know the system, and that provides comfort. Now, it's not all kind of roses and butterflies. There is, yes, a sense of security, but that security is under threat as well. There are kind of ominous undertones to it, and these come back to those same ideas we've introduced before in terms of the lack of direct ownership. So where they owned their farms back in Oklahoma, we've got another system here where They're working somewhere that they know, but they don't own it, and Steinbeck shows how that is a problem. You've also got the references to kind of the future technology coming in, and how that is kind of going to potentially cause long-term problems. And at this stage, there is this kind of sense of control coming back in that they haven't had for a while, when they're picking sort of more unfamiliar items, the kind of citrus fruits and the peaches. But it's tinged with this kind of ominous element. But Steinbeck shows how this sense of identity is kind of important here, how it's kind of central to them and their kind of happiness. Okay, so have a look at the sheet, see how you could talk around the bits of evidence that are on there. So pause. It should only take you about 5-10 minutes to kind of work out which bits you would use and how you'd use them. Right, okay. So the first thing to note here is simply these kind of repeated assertions of kind of confidence here. I'm a good picker. So whereas you've had these kind of lack of identity, these kind of worried elements in other chapters, here there's a kind of knowledge of self and a confidence that is kind of lacking elsewhere. And it kind of continues with this in the they're depicted as kind of confident in the system. They know the system. So whereas elsewhere in the novel they have been depicted as being exploited, here they're able to recognize whether they're being exploited or not, and to kind of react to this. So they arrive there, they're being told they need to pay $1 for these cotton picking bags, but they know the system and they know that this isn't the pure exploitation that you've got elsewhere. That you get, sure, it's fair. So unlike the export, this is fair. Good cotton bag, last all season, and when she's worn out, dragging, turn around, use the other end. So they know the process, and this is depicted as something important. It goes on from there. I've not quoted it on here, but they know how to use the bag for other things as well. So Steinbeck shows how this knowledge is so integral to them, that it's so important in kind of providing a sense of security. And this is kind of continued in this change to a kind of imperative and instructional voice. This narrative voice of the kind of Oklahoman, who elsewhere in the novel is uncertain, now becomes imperative, and it's directing the reader. Lean forward, drag, hoist her along. I'm good hand with the cotton, finger wise, bowl wise. So there's the assertion of knowledge again, finger wise, bowl wise, but also the kind of direction and the way that they are able to show their own kind of knowledge and security. You then get the kind of worrying aspects starting to creep into this. So long fibre, best damn cotton I ever seen, spoil her soon. Where it's California is fruitful, but there is that kind of worrying recognition that because of the kind of over farming, there's the liability to spoil the land soon. Remember, again, this is another way it creates the circular narrative. At the start of the narrative, we've got the Dust Bowl, and one of the reasons for the Dust Bowl is the over farming of cotton. The fact it's a thirsty crop, and it essentially ruins the soil because it takes too much from it. So we've got that kind of issue creeping into it. But again, you've got the confidence, but I could pick cotton if I was blind. And there's something natural in this. You've got a feeling for the cotton boll. There's something kind of as part of this person's identity linked to this. And again, you get the link into the kind of exploitation and the fact that maybe there are attempts to exploit them. Sometimes the scales is fixed. But because they know the process, they can exploit it back. And rather than there being a one-sided exploitation, there is a sense of balance created here. So sometimes he's right, you got rocks and sacks. Sometimes you're right, the scales is crooked. So it reflects that kind of balanced station within it. Other kind of ominous elements come into this, though. You get the reference to the cotton picking machine, and Steinbeck reflecting the way that technology is kind of, in the long term, taking away from the kind of human control. And you get this kind of labor imbalance again, this kind of supply and demand imbalance. So if there was only 50 of us, we could stay a while, but there's 500, she won't last hardly at all. So there's a contentment here, but there is also a self-awareness that this is short term, and there's an increasing threat. They say 1,000 men are on their way to this field. We'll be fighting for a row tomorrow, and we'll be snatching cotton quick. So they know that the exploitation is still creeping back in. There's that contentment and the circular nature, but because they don't own the land, they have no control over this process. But the last bit I've got on there, that kind of side meat tonight, by God, the fact that they have something that they can kind of take away from this, again, it coming back in, it's important to them. And at least temporarily, they're fed because they are able to take what they need from the system. Remember, back in the previous chapter, the reason the Jodes have had to kind of move on is not just Tom being hurt in the kind of fight, but it's also the fact that within this system, now the strikers have been pushed on, they've reduced the wages again, and there's hardly enough, even if they pick like their life depended on it, which it does, they're not going to get enough money to survive on. So this reference to side meat shows that in this situation where they know the system, they have a degree of control. So before we move on, just kind of link it into the kind of way that you might argue this. I've just put at the bottom of that page just a kind of an example sentence that would allow you to kind of link it into an argument. So you might start out with something along the lines of, in the circularity of the narrative and the return to the cotton fields, Steinbeck shows a sense of contentment. He describes the process of building some evidence. Through this, he shows that people need this identity, that there's security and knowledge, that where people are, you know, have that education of the system, they can thrive within it. You could also do it in reverse and show how we've also got those ominous elements coming into it. Right, so the next bit that we want to look at today is that continuation of Tom as the disciple of Casey, and we want to look at where we can see Tom in a very kind of direct way taking on Casey's ideology within this, where we mentioned before he's essentially a kind of Peter type figure, and Peter's the one who kind of sees Jesus first after his kind of crucifixion and resurrection, and the way in which he's going to kind of carry it on from that point essentially. So what I want you to do, I want you to use page 437 from the bit where Mars come in to find Tom. This is in chapter 28. He said, "Lucky Ma, I've been all day and night hiding." So you're going from that bit, and you're going to go across onto page 439, go up to the fields till you come to a sycamore on the edge, and then cut across the stream. Goodbye. And what I want you to do, I want you to just go through and I want you to pick 5 or 6 bits of evidence that are going to allow you to discuss the way in which Tom is essentially becoming Casey's disciple in a far more direct spiritual way than he was before, that this is intensified, that the connection between them has been built up as part of the narrative. Okay, so I would say it's about 3 pages, probably going to spend about 10 minutes. Pick it out, be sensible, choose the best points of evidence for this. Okay, now the first thing to kind of note here is that essentially Tom has been forced to do what Casey's done before, in the he's gone out into the wilderness, he's hiding away, he's isolated from other people, and this leads him to this kind of recognition through both looking back at what happened to Casey and it's kind of leading him forward essentially. So if we look on page 437, he's talking about Casey here. Says one time he went out in the wilderness to find his own soul, and he found he didn't have no soul that was his. Says he found just he got a little bit of a great big soul. Says the wilderness ain't no good, because his little piece of soul wasn't no good, lest it was with the rest. But I know now a fella ain't no good alone. So he's come to this same realization. I know now a fella ain't no good alone. Steinbeck is depicting Tom going through this state of realization, this anagnoriasis essentially, and realizing this kind of different perspective. And he starts to kind of reflect on Casey's words from before. He realizes that Casey isn't like other preachers. He didn't sound like no hellfire scripture. And he starts talking about the messages that Casey has put across and repeating them, reflecting on them and repeating them and finding the truth within them. For if they fall, the one will lift up his fellow, but woe to him that is alone when he falleth, for he hath not another to help him up. Now, think about the dialogue here, and Tom's kind of way of speaking takes on a more kind of archaic tone, a more kind of biblical tone to it. You've got the hath in there, you've got the falleth. This isn't part of his Oklahoma dialect. This is designed to evoke something more kind of biblical within his words. And it goes through, and he goes through similar recognitions to what Steinbeck has pointed us to elsewhere. He says most of the preaching, and he doesn't mean Casey here, he means about wider preaching. Most of the preaching is about the poor. We shall have always with us. And if you don't do nothing, if you've got nothing, why, just hold your hands out and to hell with it. You're going to get ice cream on gold plates when you're dead. And remember when we talked about the kind of ideas of false class consciousness? Well, what we've got here is a reflection of that false class consciousness. We've got this kind of idea of him depicting a world in which, you know, people are told that it doesn't matter if you've got nothing now, you're going to get ice cream on golden plates when you get to heaven. Just be happy with what you've got, you'd be content, don't try and ask for more. But that whole idea of ice cream on golden plates shows a kind of cynicism coming into Tom's language here, and a reflection that he sees the truth in this, that this is just a way to stop people from realizing just how exploited they are. And then this here preacher says to get a better reward for their work. So Casey comes in and says, actually, when we band together, you get a better reward. It's not that you simply wait for afterwards. And it continues. Well, maybe like Casey says, a fella ain't got a soul of his own, but only a piece of a big one. And then, and this is kind of depicted as his moment of realization. This is the bit that I want to look at far more directly, because it's one that's been taken and it's quite well quoted. It's been played on in lots of different ways in American culture as it goes down the years. So you get Tom's kind of final speech essentially before he exits the narrative, and it's a powerful speech in which Tom is depicted as kind of transcending his individuality essentially. He's recognizing that he's simply one part of this great big soul, and so there's almost an omniscience in this. He's going to be there in all these different circumstances. I'll be around in the dark. I'll be everywhere, wherever you look. Where there's a fight so hungry people can eat, I'll be there. Where there's a cop beating up a guy, I'll be there. So there's this kind of idea that Tom is going to enter into this kind of state of rebellion. He's going to challenge the system, and all these kind of prejudices. He's going to fight so hungry people can eat. He's going to stand up to the prejudice of the police. Um, and it kind of goes on. If Casey knowed why, I'll be in the way guys yell when they're mad, and I'll be in the way kids laugh when they're hungry and they know supper's ready. And when our folks eat the stuff, they'll raise and live in the houses they build while I'll be there. He'll be there in both the good and in the bad. It's a mindset and an ethos that he's kind of transcended into in this. And there's this recognition. See, God, I'm talking like Casey. Comes of thinking about him so much, seems like I can see him sometimes. So again, it kind of fits in with this kind of Peter image where he's the first one to see him after his death. And in this resurrection, he sees Casey now before anyone else, and he begins to act on it. So what I would recommend alongside this bit as a kind of continuation, if you haven't already read it, have a look on the blog site, linked off the iSite, because we get within that even, sorry, I've focused in this bit and how it's transferred into popular culture, and it's there in Bruce Springsteen uses this as part of one of his songs, The Ghost of Tom Joad. And it's then taken and you get a cover of it by people like Rage Against the Machine, who are very much political. And it shows just how central this is in terms of the kind of political message that Steinbeck is shaping through the narrative. And it kind of leads me into the last point that I'll kind of make for today, in the Steinbeck is essentially implying a kind of almost a Grapes of Wrath 2, and you want to think, well, what is the future implication about Tom? They're kind of jokey in terms of this, but just think, what is he implying that Tom is going to go on to do? What would the events beyond the end of this narrative look like if you had a Tom here? So just spend a few minutes thinking about it. How do you think this is actually going to play out? Okay, so I mean, I've chosen those kind of jokey titles, but I kind of imagine that Steinbeck's implication here is that if nobody else takes action, Tom will probably take on the mantle of a kind of leadership role within the strike movement. That he will, he has the capacity and the capability to lead these people in the uprising, in the wrath that Steinbeck has implied is inevitable without change. So there's a kind of ominous nature to what he does around Tom here, and the kind of implications as to what the future holds. Okay. We'll leave it there for this point. Tomorrow we'll cover the other bits, and then, as I say, I'll just start sending you various bits just to keep you sharp and to build up your knowledge around all the different texts as you kind of go through. Okay, bye bye, people.